Today. Today is March 17th, 2022, and we are here today with the author of The Black Celts. Hopefully you can all see it, The Black Celts, by Ibrahim Ali. Ibrahim, welcome. Ibrahim Ali.
Thank
Ibrahim,
you, Gabby.
welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Um, Ibrahim, first of all, I just want to thank you for joining us today. I came to the Black Celts because I am of African and Irish ancestry. I'm also adopted, and race in the 70s, as in 2022, became a really big deal. And I became interested in um, the disparity or the difference between Blacks and Irish. Because the bottom line is like I saw so much prejudice with Irish folks, and Irish folks are all within my family. And I get that Irish doesn't mean Celtic, but when I went to research about my own history, I felt like there was something not true about it. So that's enough for what I'm going to say right now. Ibrahim, please tell us what brought you to write this book, and what inspired you.
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. Um, I was born in Wales, so again in a very multicultural part of town. And in those days, if you're Irish, if you're Somali, African, Caribbean, etc., you all lived in the same part of town. And obviously because of racism, and in those days was very a lot of segregation. But what's interesting is that there was two things that brought me to the Black Celts. One is, as an avid reader, when I went to university, I was reading lots of folklore, Irish folklore, and I think I read nearly every version of the ancient annals of Ireland that existed. And there's this clearly presence of Africans there. It says the first woman of Ireland was Kizar from the island of Moreau. And straight away, I knew Moreau Island is a reference to Kush, and it's a reference because it's surrounded by three sides by the River Nile. And so obviously, as interested in studying, I researched it. And then Bob Quinn did the Atlantean series, documentaries, which was absolutely amazing. And I was talking to him a few weeks ago, and he's just an incredible sort of journey that he's had. And actually, from the point of view of he's the same as myself. We're both against Eurocentrism. How Eurocentrism has written, African history and Latin American history and history of people of color from a different perspective. And it's about challenging that. It's about actually allowing other viewpoints, that are probably more accurate.
Yeah. I was looking up the stone chambers here in New York, and every time I go to look up some kind of history about the Celts, it's always shrouded in mystery. Why do you think that is?
Because the British and Irish are not Celts. When you're born in Wales, you look around you and you see very dark-haired individuals. I used to have an afro when I was younger, and some people in Wales had better afros than I had. So as an immigrant population, it was something we talked about behind closed doors. We really did talk about these things, because. And I remember a BBC documentary actually picked up on it once, that the immigrant population, realized they settled amongst people who, were swarthy, were Mediterranean, and weren't Celtic at all. So when you live there, you can see that there were no blonde, blue-eyed, pale Celts there at all.
Yeah. It's like, why this is so important to me is because, for a lot of you folks out there who may be watching or don't know me, I grew up in a foster family that I went into in 1967 because my Irish mother's family did not want me there because my father is Black. So I got impacted very early with the race dynamics. And then I reunited with my biological mother in my 20s and met all these people with red hair and blonde hair and big hair.
Mm.
And this is back in the 70s, where my father, my adopted father, was very prejudiced against white people because he had come from World War II and then had to sit in the back of the train. So I started to see all these people who were mixed, and they're mixed with like Irish and Black. And I'm starting to wonder, like, wow, there's all this mixing going on, and it's not all slave master mixing, but yet there's this huge separation around race. But then I see now with the new genome and everything coming out with all the DNA studies, they're tracing the Celts back to the Wanche people of the Canary Islands, to Algeria now and Morocco. What do you think about all of that?
I think Bob Quinn was, he's still going straight, going strong. He hates the title Celts.
Uh-huh.
And he was ahead of me because I presumed that some Celts had arrived, and then with this edition, I really tried to find any trace of the Celts at all, even a little bit, and you just couldn't find any traces.
Yeah.
And even in the Welsh triad, the ancient Welsh books, it says, the Gauls, the small amount of Gauls that arrived, and they were the last to arrive, settled in the Isle of Wight. And it says they would only become Britons or Cymry after 9 generations. So so in other words, the indigenous inhabitants, the Cymry, obviously saw the Gauls, who were the Celts essentially, as absolute strangers that only arrived, fairly recently. So I mean, you've got scholars like Professor Cunliffe and all these people who still using the title Celts.
Yeah.
But I mean, 1706 is really when that title appeared, and they were there. And essentially, it's when Britain, Ireland, Scotland, was it Britain, Scotland, and Ireland become the United Kingdom, the Act of Union.
Yeah.
So they had to find a name to call themselves, and so they thought, okay, we'll pick. They couldn't use the word Gaul, so they used Celti.
God. And why couldn't they use the word Gaul?
Because it's very French, and the English hated the French. So they were searching for a word to unite sort of these new kingdoms that came under the Queen, or king, whoever it was, the king then. So they picked up a title that was not relevant historically.
Yeah.
But now the people are now sort of brainwashed into thinking that they were Celts, and they weren't. The Gaels aren't Celts. The Cymry are not Celts. And you obviously have the trickle of the Gauls, who look nothing like the ancient Silures of South Wales. And if you look in the book, you've got the pictures of the Silures of Cardiff Castle.
Yeah.
Obviously an African people.
Yeah. So you're saying they're not Celts, they're African.
You know what? The more and more I researched it, the more and more I was like, oh my gosh, they're absolutely African. I mean, even the recent strontium isotope analysis was amazing. Sorry, it's in the book, and it's 60% of the population of London was African 2,000 years ago.
Oh my goodness! When I did my DNA testing, which I understand that most of those DNA places are owned by the Mormon churches, I understand it. I saw just from my mother's side, it went. I said, "Wow, I'm part of the Wanche people, Northern Algeria. They didn't even test my father's side. Sub-Saharan Africa, Hamites, of course. Then the Avars and over there as well." But as I start to look at the migrations of human beings, so we're saying that, okay, here's Sub-Saharan Africans. They made their way north. They didn't want to fight with the Phoenicians. They got in those boats. They made their ways to different islands. Then some Libyans and what's now Libya, what's now Morocco, all there in Northern Africa. They said, let's just go away. And they traveled the world. And there are some theories that say then those folks became the actual indigenous peoples of the world and the Americas and the world in general. How do you feel about that? Or have you found any evidence to show that is so or not so?
One thing even as a child, I loved anthropology. I loved really looking at the bones and skeletons and reading it, but reading it from an Afrocentric point of view, from my own point of view. I was able to distinguish the data, and I'd read data, the Journal of Biometrica.
Yeah.
Obviously, the way they collected the bones, I said in the books, they didn't just find them in isolated graves. They actually, Europeans were headhunters. They actually went and did a lot of bad things to get these bones, and we should acknowledge that it was wrong. But when we analyzed the data, even this chap called Morant, he did what's called the coefficient of racial likeness. And what's interesting is their aim was to find the Aryan race. That's what they wanted to find. Instead, they found the indigenous population of Britain is closest to the Guanches, the people of what was it now? Essentially Southern Mediterranean, Africa, Libya. I mean, obviously they only had a small sample, so if they looked even further, they would have found even deeper, stronger connections. But then, if people argue that's data that's from a long time ago, the strontium isotope data also confirms that some of those people were born and brought up in Africa as well. So,
would you mind, just for the audience, breaking down the strontium isotope, what that means, like in lay talk? Yeah,
it's really, in basic analysis, is that if you live in, say, Egypt and you grow up there, then the food that you eat, essentially, I mean, obviously the calcium in the bones, etc. These minerals, they become part of your bones. And so based on the actual ratio of these chemicals, strontium and other isotopes, things that sort of degrade with time, they can actually, they got a map of different regions. So they can say, well, actually this person grew up on the Nile, from the analysis of the bones, because
I see.
up to the age of, I think it's like 15 or 18 or something, you're laying down all these minerals into your bones. So you travel from Egypt to England, you die, and then you analyze your bones. They can say, well, this person actually grew up in a warmer climate.
So if someone analyzed my bones in, like, say, a couple of thousand years, and they found all this fried chicken in there and some Haagen-Dazs ice cream, they would be able to presume that maybe I grew up in a place that had a lot of fried chicken or something.
It kind of proves that some migrated a long time ago, and some kept going back and forth. That's the interesting thing. That thing I love is these people were still going back and forth from Africa to Britain, Africa to Ireland, along the sea routes. So it's mainly along the sea routes of the west coast. And, but even when you look at these so-called Celtic graves, and then you analyze them, I mean, and there's a lot of sort of data in the book on that. But let's put in layman's terms. If you compare those chariot graves of northeast England, and then you compare them to those of Gaul in France, what you find is the human remains are totally different.
Yeah.
And so it shows there's no real migration from one place to another, but there's a migration of ideas. So people in, say, Britain might have taken some ideas and made it their own.
Yeah.
In terms of those beautiful sort of gold pieces and et cetera, et cetera. So there's no migration of people, but ideas.
Yeah. It's interesting, this term we have that we created, this construct called race, and what is white and what is black. You can imagine the surprise when I tell my, some of my Irish friends who seem to have more Celtic ancestry, hey, you're African. I mean, not just like African from 200,000 years ago, but like from 15,000 years ago, possibly, or 4,000 years ago. And that shifts then the context when we think about race, or we think about otherness, right? Because
I mean, sorry.
No.
I was going to quickly say that there's a change over the last, say, 10 years. There's a change, because I started doing this 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Or more, actually. And in those days, there was a different attitude, I found. I think I would talk to a lot of Irish people in book fairs, etc., and just lectures and talks and stuff. And a lot of people would tell me stories, and people would say, oh, I'm the McCarthys, and the McCarthys are known as the yellow McCarthys because we're always tinted and we got a lot of melanin more than others, etc. And people would come and tell me that their granddad had really thick curly hair, and they always thought they had African blood in them, etc., etc. So I mean, maybe because I'm an empath and people tell me people feel confident in telling me things, which is great. I love storytellers, and people would tell me these things, and I remember, in South Wales, I mean, I was talking to an indigenous person from South Wales, and they told me that when they grew up, they thought that they thought grandma was actually, black. And I asked, and this is interesting, this is a true story. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, because of the features and the way, they appeared, they thought they had African ancestry and stuff. And another friend of mine was afraid that his sister was going to have a black child. And I said, well, is the partner black? No, but it always happens. And that's when we talk about the so-called the blue spot at the back of that babies are born with, which is quite frequent. And that happens in Wales an awful lot, So people, and when you really listen to people and you're just not judgmental, and you just kind of listening to stories, people will share that they know they have got mixed ancestry, because everybody is mixed. There's no purity.
Let me ask you a question, because I think we can agree there's an economic disparity globally. And here in the West, we can, we've experienced it, or we see it, it's around us, whether we've experienced it personally or not. And we tend to think, and there's a lot of evidence around, and I would conclude that here in the States where I'm at, that Black and brown people are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, right? Now, you were there in Wales, and you're saying there are a whole bunch of white folks who look kind of Black, and you did a lot of official research around it to get to the ancestry. Did you see a connection between those folks who seemed more Blackish and their economic status with those who didn't seem more Blackish? I'm just curious.
Interestingly, no.
Okay.
I mean, it is interesting, but because obviously coming from Africa, we have a clan system and tribal systems, and that's how we identify each other. But obviously in Britain they don't, in a sense. It's more village, etc., etc. And I think sometimes there is a huge ethnic variety amongst the indigenous people of Britain, and it's clear, there is, obviously. Like Tom Jones, for example. Tom Jones went to the United States, and everybody thought he was a brother, So he himself said, what I think. He said to Larry King, he said, look, I think I do have Black ancestry, But that's where I grew up. I grew up where everybody was like that.
It's so funny that we get so like, oh my gosh, and this person is this, and that person, and I have an uncle. But it's kind of ridiculous in a way, right? When you think about it, how we're really all intermixed and just traveled from here to there, and we get hung up on hue because it's related to economic status.
Because of colonialism. Because of colonialism. The colonialism introduced that kind of emphasis on skin shade.
Yeah.
They made up false histories as if, they always had to look for an elite. An elite had to be light-skinned. And a light-skinned group invaded East Africa and took over this. And I, as a teenager, I wrote to Professor I.M. Lewis, and I told him off. I said, look, these graves you're talking about were built by my ancestors. One of them has my great-great-grandfather's name. And so there isn't a mythical Arab race that invaded and brought civilization. They always have to look for Phoenicians or Arabian or something else, bringing something instead of, well, maybe the indigenous people just built it themselves.
Yeah. I know the Amazigh people in Kabul in northern Africa, and also in Algeria and in Morocco, are fighting for their indigeneity. They're saying we're not Berbers, we're not Arab, we've been Arabicized, and we want our own indigeneity. And it was very strange for me, because here's all these are white people saying so, Michael, it made me, and this was during the height of George Floyd here, the summer of George Floyd here in New York. Ibrahim, I want to thank you for coming on. We're about to wrap it up. I know you have the book there. I'm showing people, listen, I bought this book. I was so excited to get this book because I've been interested in anthropology and my own anthropology. There's a lot of us out there. We identify as Black, and we are Black, right? and we share this mixed ancestry, which is so much history. And what I'm finding is that there's a lot of Irish folks, a lot of Celtic folks in general, Celtic descendants of the Celts, who don't know their history. They don't even know that a lot of people don't even like the word Celts or Celts. I want to thank you for being on today. I'd love to have you back on in the future, perhaps with Professor Quinn as well. Perhaps you can both come on together and have a longer show. And I thank you so much for writing this book because it's meant the world to me. And just thank
Thank
you
you,
to you
Gabby.
all. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really love talking to you. Always love talking to you.
Yes. Same here. Same here, brother. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Happy St. Patty's Day, everybody. Go and just hug all your mixed friends. Hug all your friends. Okay. And just know at the end of the day, really, we're all African. Just like at what point in time did we come over? Welcome to Face to Face. Presenza. See you next time around.